Hello everyone, and welcome to the 278th episode of AnalOIzing Evil, featuring Billy Butcher from The Boys. Now I wanted to introduce this video by greeting you the way Billy would, but YouTube isn't too much of a fan of using swear words in the beginning of videos, so unfortunately, I couldn't. However, I was able to over on Patreon, so if you'd like to see that, as well as gain access to my videos ad-free and a day early for as low as $2 a month, consider heading over there and signing up to become a patron. That aside, there was quite a few of you who wanted to see an episode on Butcher after the Homelander episode, and I'd figure I'd deliver on that, so here we are. And in this video, we're going to talk about all the things that makes one of the heroes of this story not so heroic in so many different ways. But before we get started with that, much like the boys themselves needed to be mindful of their security, it's often the case that in this digital age we live in that we too need to do the same, which you can easily accomplish with our sponsor for this video, Obscura. As time has passed, it seems that everywhere you go on the internet, any given platform will ask you for your face, your ID, or your phone number just so you can have bare minimum access to their services. And with Australia and 25 US states passing social media and age verification laws, you can expect to hand over more and more of your personal information in the near future. But that's where Obscura comes in. Obscura is the world's most private VPN, as unlike traditional VPNs that can see both your identity and the sites you visit, Obscura is a VPN that physically can't link who you are with your internet activity, and its stealth protocol works where other VPNs get blocked. But one of the best things about Obscura, aside from its built-in ad and online tracking blocker, is the fact that it's open source, and any fellow nerds can check their source code and servers for themselves to give you a peace of mind that other VPNs just can't. I, for one, was blown away by just how secure Obscura is, and of course how easy it is to use on all my devices. But what really got me is how transparent they are with their product, as transparency is something that a lot of companies in this day and age sorely lack, and it's something that I know a lot of you appreciate. And to make things even better, you don't even need to link a personal email to your account to get Obscura, making it even more private than it already was. So if you want a VPN that not only works phenomenally, but keeps you safe and secure more than any other can, be sure to head over to obscura.com/vile by clicking the link in the description, or scanning the QR code on your screen, where you can get 25% off a subscription for only $6 a month. Thank you, Obscura, for sponsoring this video. Now without further ado, let's begin. A man who loses everything and wants for nothing but revenge can count himself as one of the most dangerous men living. A man with no limits and few lines they won't cross. And Billy Butcher is one such man. Born in London, England, Billy was raised by a man nearly as monstrous as the monster he created. His father, Sam Butcher. In short, Sam was nothing, the quintessential macho man who believed that to be anything less than the biggest bastard a man could be was to be weak. A poor excuse for a human being whose claim to fame was being a belligerent drunk and misanthrope who mercilessly beat his two boys so he could both take his frustrations out on them and make them into who he thought they should be. Tough guys who would navigate a world that was only a sea of shit, a sea that you either sank or swam in. With a father like that, both Billy and his brother Lenny lived a life of constant fear, ever awaiting the next beating from their father that wasn't just a possibility, but a guarantee. And well, what Sam did to his sons ended up producing the results he wanted, at least as far as Billy is concerned. As during a flashback when Butcher is trapped in one of Mindstorm's nightmares, we find that as a result of his father's abuse and conditioning, that Billy became in many ways a mirror image of his father. During this nightmare, we're shown that Billy got in trouble at school at one point for selling marijuana, and after his teacher reprimanded him for it and told him that he was smart and that he didn't want him to end up like his father, Billy flew into a rage and began beating him while calling him a snotty little cunt, just like his father did to him when he was beating him in another memory we witness. And as Billy moved on to the next stages of his life, this behavior would only get worse. It's no wonder then that once Billy was old enough to escape his father's grasp, he jumped at the chance to do so, leaving his home to join the SAS where he would use the tools his father pounded into him to great effect. Trained to become a hardened Special Forces agent, Billy would go on to serve in numerous conflicts over the course of his life, most notably in Afghanistan alongside American forces, where he committed numerous atrocities, torturing and murdering several enemy combatants, and perhaps even civilians, in order to accomplish his missions. A man who was so single-minded in the pursuit of his goals that at one point, he led a squad on a mission to infiltrate the stronghold of a mid-level ISIS member, and got every one of them killed because he refused to retreat when given information about incoming enemy reinforcements, with his best friend Joe Kessler counting himself as one of those casualties. But when he wasn't out in the field torturing and murdering on behalf of his country and its allies, he was seemingly doing so in facilities across the world. As Butcher also worked in Guantanamo Bay at one point torturing prisoners, as he mentions to Huey that it took them waterboarding Khalid Sheikh Mohammed 183 times over 6 months just to get him to talk once. Now you'd expect all of this death he witnessed on Unleashed to have some sort of effect on Butcher psychologically, and in the beginning, it just might have. But because Billy was conditioned by his father to become a hardened man, it's reasonable to assume that whatever horror the carnage he immersed himself in during his time as a soldier may have instilled with any other person had little to no effect on him from the outset. And this only becomes more true when you consider that Butcher never really displays any sort of shame or regret for murdering anyone in this story, nor does he seem saddened or mortified when doing so. Furthermore, we find Billy admitting towards the end of this series that he's enjoyed every single one of his kills, his acts of violence. A man who to some degree is a sadist, but more so one who enjoys the rush of blood and adrenaline that comes to him in moments where he's able to unleash in full all the fury and hatred built up inside him that in many ways is likely an orgasmic experience for Butcher. An animal finally sinking its teeth into its prey, who gorges itself on carnage. Now that isn't to say that Butcher lacks empathy. Far from it, but rather a man who views any adversary he faces as just that, an adversary, someone who needs a slap that the one handing out the slap need not feel for in any way, because that's just the way it is. No, Butcher is rarely, if ever, ashamed of what he does, or what he's done. He feels no guilt for felling foe after foe because it's what he must do, either for himself or for the people he truly does have empathy for, his loved ones. 6 months after Butcher left his childhood home for training, his younger brother Lenny, who couldn't bear the abuse his father doled out to him, abuse that became even more intense following his brother's abscondment, chose to take his own life to save himself from this never-ending nightmare of constant pain, both physical and mental. And the death of his younger brother, one of the few people in Billy's family who he felt any sort of true affection for, tore Billy's heart asunder, sending him reeling in the wake of the death of the only person in his life who was innocent and pure. A kind and gentle boy who loved magic, that was the only light that could pierce the darkness, that were the lives they lived under their father's shadow. What made his death all the more heart-wrenching for Billy, though, was the fact that for the longest time, Billy was his brother's keeper, his protector, the shield that would stand between him and his father, because Billy could take it, possessing a fortitude that enabled him to stomach the blows his father pummeled his body with. As unlike Lenny, whose fear in the face of his father's wrath would turn into a despair that only grew more and more each time his father laid a hand on him, Billy's fear turned into rage and hatred, which only grew over time in the same way that Lenny's despair did. So when Lenny took his own life, Billy blamed himself, even more so because Lenny had warned him that he wouldn't be able to bear their father alone when Billy was leaving, and because he chose to reprimand him in the same way their father did for being weak, before he chose to leave regardless. It would make sense then that Billy quickly began to unleash violence on others during his time in the military, because Billy, as much as he didn't want to be, very much became a man like his father. And much like his father, to deal with his feelings, Billy didn't deal with them at all. Rather, he stuffed them down and let them fester until the time came where he was able to release some of those feelings by inflicting pain onto others. Despite this, and despite all that he'd done while serving his country, Butcher, like any soldier, was eventually relieved of duty. And like anyone with as storied of a history as his, it was hard for him to adjust to a civilian life, to reconcile who he was and needed to be on the outside with who he was and what he'd done on the inside, as we learn through a conversation he has with the imagined version of Joe Kessler. But as hard as that was and is for anyone with a story like Butcher's, he eventually managed to find a great deal of happiness after he met the woman who would one day become his wife, Becca. From the few flashbacks we receive of their time together, we find that Butcher was quite the happy man, one who seemed to have put the past behind him in every way he could, so he might enjoy the new life he'd found with the love of his life. While that's true, according to Becca, he was always one bad day away from pummeling someone to death in a parking lot, and while she tried to be the woman he needed her to be, the canary in his coal mine much like Lenny was once upon a time, she often felt ill-equipped to deal with his insecurities and trauma. Despite this, by all accounts, Billy and Becca seemed to have lived a happy and carefree life while they were together. But once Becca was taken from him by Homelander, that all changed. Not just because Becca was gone, but because the fact that she had been taken from him caused Butcher to slip back into his old self. The man who was relentless, merciless, and brutal, who was now ready to do whatever it took to find out what had happened to his wife and make sure that the monster responsible for her disappearance paid the ultimate price for taking her from him. So not knowing whether Becca had gone missing because she had been kidnapped or killed, Butcher decided to find out the truth by helping to form and becoming a part of the Boys, a team of men dedicated to bringing down Supes that was backed up by the CIA, whose ultimate goal was to bring to light the various crimes of Vought and to bring them down, which meant bringing down Homelander, the man who had taken Butcher's world from him. Now over time, we see that he grows to care for each member of the Boys in his own way, But when it comes down to it, his love for them is superseded by his mission to take down Homelander and what they can do for him, as Butcher is frequently shown to be willing to use any member of the boys to further his goals throughout this story, even if that means betraying their trust, putting them in harm's way, or even placing them in situations where he knows they might perish. And similarly, he has little to no regard for anyone connected to them, especially if they're a soup, which is exemplified for us with his actions against Kimiko's brother Kenji, his off-and-on abuse of Starlight prior to her joining the boys, and his treatment of and subsequent murder of Victoria Newman, even when it seemed that she turned over a new leaf and was ready to help bring down Homelander and Vought alongside the boys. Now, I'd say that part of the reason he's willing to endanger his friends is likely because in Butcher's mind, if they were sacrificed for his vengeance, they too would be avenged in the process, for their lives would be forfeit at the hands of Vought and Homelander, or their auxiliaries, and once they were taken down, they too would receive the same justice that he sought for the sake of Becca's memory, which seems on brand for the warped sense of justice and nobility that Butcher has formulated over the course of his life. But while the frequent betrayal of the trust of those closest to him to the point that he's willing to endanger their lives is heinous, that pales in comparison to what Butcher is willing to do to anyone who stands in his way that isn't connected to him. When it comes to Butcher's endangerment of the boys, or any other innocent, there are times when he comes to his senses and realizes what he's doing to the people he loves. And so there are many times throughout this story where Billy reins himself in and chooses not to betray them. But there is not a single instance in this story that I can recall where Butcher feels any sort of remorse for harming someone that gets in his way. As though this man's name is William Butcher, there are two men residing in that body. Billy, the man who loves and cares for the people closest to him and who will do anything to protect them, and Butcher, the monster forged by an abusive father who wished to make him into exactly what he became, that will similarly do anything to avenge anyone close to him that's been harmed by another person. And I do mean anything. Now, he does understand on some level that what he's doing is wrong, as when we're shown that flashback of him beating his teacher that I mentioned earlier, it's intermixed with several scenes of him savaging other people, and also in his hallucination of Becca and Joe, which shows the war constantly waging inside him between the two halves of himself. But even these things aren't an acknowledgement of Butcher's guilt for harming or killing anyone he perceives to be an adversary, but rather his distaste for the fact that he is very much a man like his father, a man he despised, and a man he never wanted to be. So no, Butcher feels no remorse when it comes to his enemies, and in fact, as we touched on earlier, he feels a great amount of pleasure when harming them and after the fact in knowing that they've been dealt with. At one point, MM tells Butcher that his father once told him that if you don't draw the line somewhere, you won't know where to stand. But for Billy Butcher, the only line is the finish line, and that is part of the great tragedy of Butcher's character. Butcher is a single-minded man. He's an intelligent man, a cunning man, but one who rarely, if ever, truly understands that his pursuit of what he perceives to be justice only causes harm to himself and those around him, which is something that many people around him try to get him to understand, but always fail to accomplish. In Season 1, when the boys are in trouble and Huey wants to save them, Butcher wants to leave them behind, because saving them would derail the accomplishment of their mission of taking down Vought and Homelander. And in response, Huey says, "Then what? Becca comes back from the dead. Robin too. This is never gonna stop. It's just gonna be more blood and awfulness." But Butcher responds by saying that that's the fucking game, and calls him a pathetic cunt and an insult to Robin's memory when he still refuses to help. Later on in a conversation with Mallory, she highlights the fallacy of Butcher's pursuit of revenge for the sake of Becca or her memory by saying that all of this was never about Ryan or Becca, always for you, for the hate inside that you want to let loose on the world. I thought maybe you'd changed, but I was wrong. You are your father. You always have been. And she's right. Butcher is a man who, through suffering great trauma, is incapable of properly dealing with his feelings. A man who knows only anger, hatred, and violence, who uses those things to deal with his feelings and to make himself feel better in the moment, as he doesn't know how to do anything else. But in the long run, none of what he does or what he's become makes him feel much better at all. In fact, it only sends him down further into the black abyss his father tossed him into, to make him into more of a beast that can do nothing but claw at the bars of the cage that it's helped to build for itself. That's why, at the end of this story, even after he's forged for himself a new family that he by all rights could find comfort in, that Billy is unable to put Butcher aside, something that's only reinforced for him by Ryan's rebuke of his offer to start a new life somewhere, and the death of Terror, confirming for Billy in his mind that he is a man alone who was made to do one thing, and one thing only: pursue relentlessly the eradication of what he perceives to be a threat to the people he cares for, and the world itself. A man who would only be able to rest when he's either dead, broken beyond repair, or left purposeless and likely drowning in the only other thing aside from violence that managed to numb his feelings. The poison that his father also chose to do much the same. The poison that he rewarded him with for being a man just like him. And it's this belief that he could never be anything more than the monster that all he witnessed and experienced made him into, that nearly saw Butcher committing genocide. Now, something I've talked about in previous episodes involving superheroes is just how terrifying living in a world with them would be for the average person. The idea of superheroes is an awesome one, as it instills within you the notion that if only you lived in the world where superheroism was possible, that you too could get some of those powers for yourself and become one of these mighty larger-than-life figures. But in reality, even in universes where superheroes do exist, they make up an infinitely small percentage of the population, with perhaps only a few thousand of them in any given version of our world or other worlds at any given time, which leaves the rest of us, billions of us, living in a world where the smallest percentage of the population has an overwhelming amount of influence over our lives. A world where you're more likely to be crushed as two supercharged beings wreak havoc through your city as they fight one another than you are to enjoy any kind of benefit from their existence. So with that in mind, Butcher isn't wrong to believe that the world would be better off without soups, and he's not necessarily wrong for thinking that the best way to prevent the world from suffering at their hands is to get rid of them altogether, as in all likelihood, the genocide of a few thousand soups would prevent the harm or deaths of possibly thousands or even millions of civilians. But at the same time, he was wrong. There is a scenario where a soup genocide would be the right thing to do, but that's a scenario where the world is the world that Homelander may have eventually created had he lived long enough to see his ambitions to become a god realized. While a lot of soups are shown to be scumbags and evildoers throughout this story, there are plenty more who aren't. People who are decent and good, because even though they're soups, they're still human beings, and in many cases, it's more often the case that they're terrible people because Vought has enabled them to be, and conditioned them to be, not because that's who they are inherently. So a soup genocide, while being an option, should be the last resort of a desperate populace who have been forced to suffer under the iron fist of soup supremacy. But Butcher was never capable of seeing that. He saw the good in people like Starlight and Kimiko, but in his mind, that good meant nothing in the face of the fact that eventually there could be another Homelander, or many Homelanders. And for Butcher, genocide was not a last resort, but a necessary evil. In reality, it was an unnecessary evil, at least at the time that he wished to see it realized. And Huey understood that. The man who, much like Lenny, much like Joe Kessler, and much like Becca, was the force for good in Butcher's life who was able to get through to him in some way when he was incapable of fighting through the ever-present darkness clouding his mind. But in the end, when he felt he had nothing left to him but his pain, his hatred, and his rage, it was impossible for him to realize how wrong he was. For a moment, in truly seeing Huey, and through him seeing Lenny, he was, but only for a moment, for that's another piece of the tragedy of Butcher's character, that in being a savage beast, he was only capable of finding clarity in moments that were never permanent, and so like any maddened monstrosity, his rampage could only be ended through finality, through death. And so it was that Butcher, the boy named Billy who endured so much pain and torment and came out the other side a monster, was finally put down, and that's a crying shame, for Billy was never truly a monster. He was just a human, and being a human hurts. Billy was a kind man, a gentleman, a fun-loving man with a mighty sense of humor and a staunch loyalty to the people he cared about. But Butcher, well, Butcher was a butcher, a spiteful, vengeful, and hate-filled man whose rage could scarcely be contained once a person he loved was harmed or had been taken from him. A creature that would pursue to the ends of the earth the villains who dared to take from him those dear to him, even if it meant killing hundreds or even thousands, innocent and guilty alike. And now we've come to the final aspect of the tragedy of Butcher's character, that in acknowledging all that he became and all that he had done, that Butcher, much like he had become a man like his father, became a man like the people he sought to destroy, a man like Homelander. Homelander, like Billy, was a man forged by the trauma he experienced in his youth, but unlike Homelander, who was deprived of love when he was young and became an insecure man who desperately wanted to be loved, Billy's trauma caused him to become a violent, brutal, and hate-filled man who reveled in carnage. But they both became single-minded in the pursuit of their goals, and became men they never wanted to be as a result. A man who repulsed everyone he came in contact with as he endeavored to earn their love, and a man who was willing to harm anyone necessary to achieve his revenge, even the innocents and loved ones that he was trying to protect or avenge. The parallels between the two are shown to us often in this story, but arguably the best one we're given is when Homelander, after nearly beating Ryan to death for betraying him, tells Butcher that Ryan is alive because he's strong, because he's his son, and he's a god, just like Billy was strong because his father had forced him to be strong. And though Billy was in many ways better than the people he sought to take down, he wasn't better by much, for he was still a man who was as ruthless as they were, who would have burned the world to the ground to see his goals realized, even if his goals were more noble than theirs. And when it comes down to it, in the end, Billy Butcher suffered at the hands of his father, suffered at the hands of his enemies, and suffered at his own hands, immersing himself fully in a trauma he could never confront and never escape. A man who felt that all that he was made him incapable of being anything but a blight on those around him. A man who could not have children or be a role model because of what he carried with him and feared to pass down to them or anyone else close to him as a result. And even when he had people right in front of him who loved him despite all that he was and all that he had done, he was incapable of seeing the salvation they could bring him, of seeing that the light they managed to bring to his life could be more than just a moment. And so Billy Butcher languished in darkness until the very end, until it had consumed him, and the only light left to him was forced to eradicate him for the sake of everyone else. A man who could not help but become the demon he became, as he walked a path in life that was thoroughly entrenched in evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Butcher? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially our Dark Lord patrons, Elijah Kai VA, Mr. Awesome, Louis Noxtator, Just Keeping It Real, Lachlan, Atris Rain, Seldsopa, Him Downstairs, Off Mega, Beep Boop, Lorenzo Antonino, Eli Livingston, and Moondog. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.